Hello and welcome to game 367 from CCC9's semifinals. This one was one of the most beautiful positional tortures that I've seen Lilla execute, and it was with black, so this is quite an amazing game. Stockfish started here with b3, and this is called the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack, where white's idea is quite simple. He's anticipating black going kingside with the king, and then he wants this bishop on this very strong diagonal to have a very nice view of black's kingside. And he wants to do this quickly before black maybe has a chance to install his bishop on g7. And to this idea, black universally always plays here e5. And the idea is to blunt this bishop on b2, reduce its scope as much as possible. And then black wants to defend this pawn very heavily and keep it on e5. And then this bishop from b2 will bite on wood or on plastic, depending what material the pieces are made of. So here now, after bishop b2, we have knight c6 defending this pawn on e5. And if you've seen my previous video, then you know that this is the best way to defend that pawn. And to this, Stockfish now replied with e3, which is another very logical move. White's idea is to make this bishop work, so he wants to do everything possible to get rid of this e5 pawn, and he wants to attack it with these pawns and make it flinch or take. And it's much easier to attack with f4 or d4 if there's a pawn on e3 defending these. If you play here e4, then getting in this break is much more difficult. So here after e3, Lilla now continued with d5. Of course, she's taking the center since Stockfish allowed it, and you should always do this if your opponent allows it, because then you control quite a lot of important central squares. Stockfish now continued with bishop b5, and he's quite simply threatening to take this pawn on e5, since this knight on c6 is now pinned. And black's main defensive idea here is bishop d6, defending this pawn. And if allowed, then black would like to play knight e7 to defend this knight, and then play a6 and try to get the bishop pair, and then black would stay quite well. But of course, white doesn't just sit and wait, and he puts even more pressure on this pawn on e5, usually with f4. Remember that this pawn can't take on f4 or advance, because then this bishop takes on g7 and wins the rook on h8. So here a good move for black is to insert this queen h4 check to force g3 and weaken white's kingside, and then drop back the bishop to e7 to defend this pawn. And now white usually puts even more pressure on e5 with knight f3, and this now forces either bishop g4 or f6. This is the more commonly played move, and the game is relatively equal in this position. But after bishop b5, Lilla played another move, and this is quite an amazing concept that she came up with. She played here knight e7, basically giving up this pawn on e5. Not only giving it up, but inviting Stockfish to take this pawn. And what's her idea? Well, after this bishop takes, she now plays a6, and one of these bishops will be lost. This bishop can't retreat, because then white loses this bishop on e5. So this bishop has to take, and after knight takes and bishop back, black gains the bishop pair. But not only the bishop pair, she now can play here bishop d6, and this bishop has a nice diagonal, and the queen can also come up and put pressure on the white king side. And this knight e7 idea is not completely new. This has been played before by grandmasters. In 2016 there were two games, one at a lower level, and a couple of months later Morozevich, the very creative Russian player, played this variation. And it's just an amazing idea. I mean, the whole concept of white's play is to make this bishop work, make it see the king side. So white does everything possible to get rid of this pawn on e5. And black just quite simply gives it up. This very important central e5 pawn, it's quite amazing. So here now, after bishop takes a6, bishop takes, knight takes, and bishop back, Morozevich played here bishop d6, and eventually he lost, but not because of the opening. But here Lilla came up with a very, very strong move, an even better move than bishop d6, and she played here queen g5. And this is now a completely new game, it hasn't been played before. And this queen now, as we can see, is attacking this pawn on g2. It's also defending the pawn on g7, so this bishop can come out. And defending this pawn on g2 is quite difficult. One of the weaker attempts to defend that pawn is to push it forward to g3. This is weakening the like squares too much in white's camp. And remember that white doesn't have a like square bishop, he took that knight on c6, and black does have a like square bishop, and that at this level would be just quite simply a deadly advantage for black. Here black could immediately play bishop g4 to attack this queen and more importantly take away squares from the knight, not allowing it to develop easily, and then this would also block in this rook on h1. For example, if this knight would go to f3, then with queen h5 this knight would be lost because it's attacked twice, it cannot be defended once more, and black wins the game. Alternatively, white could develop this knight to e2, but then bishop f3 could come, and this is again very good for black. It attacks this rook. And now if white castles, then it castles right into black's attack, because h5, h4 could come. Black would take on g3 and try to mate white on the h file with the rook. And this idea is very, very difficult to stop. After bishop g4, instead of knight e2, a better way would be f3. But again, after bishop f5, white's king side is just too weak. The like squares are too weak. Black is castling queen side, and then this idea with h5, h4 again works because this rook on h1 is undefended. And after queen g5, there are some other ideas like knight f3, but this also leads to black's advantage. The best defense here for white is also what Stockfish played, and that is king f1. Don't push any pawns here to weaken the king side and defend this pawn on g2 with the king. This is the most solid approach for white, but this also has downsides, and that is this king now moved, so white can castle, and that means that this rook on h1 is very hard to get out from there. Lilla now continued with bishop g4 anyway, and Stockfish developed now knight to e2, and Lilla castled long. And in this position, Lilla is already threatening to play d4, making use of the fact that this knight is pinned and it's not defending the d4 square. And this move d4 would be really, really strong for black. Just to illustrate the strength of this move, let's make a passing move for white, let's say a3. Now after d4, black is threatening to take here on e3, and since this pawn on d2 is pinned to the queen, black would be forced to take back with the f-pawn. But here comes the point now, the queen could take on e3 and win a pawn and maintain the attack, because again this pawn is pinned to the queen, and if this pawn takes, then black gets back his queen with check, and after king f2 he's also winning this rook on h1 and black wins. And after d4, taking this pawn also doesn't work, because now the e file opens up for black, and after moves like queen h5 and rook e8, this knight is in trouble and white's position would collapse very, very soon. Alternatively, taking with the bishop here also doesn't work, because now the rook can take, and after pawn takes, black again with knight d4 puts pressure on the spin knight on e2. And it's not so easy to get rid of this bishop on g4 pinning the knight, because now after h3 black could play queen h6 to pin this pawn to this rook on h1. So white's life in this position is not easy at all. And after long castles and right before d4 comes, he could try h3 here, but now the bishop can take on e2 and d4 is still coming, and black opens lines and this king is stuck in the center and this rook is still in the corner, and black would be better. For example, white could try here h4, but after queen g6 and e4, trying to maintain everything closed, f5 comes and lines will be open and this king is still stuck in the center. So after long castles, Stockfish considered that best is to play d4 here himself, not allow black to get that in. But now in this position, since the center is kind of clarified and kind of stable, Lilla immediately went for the attack with h5. And her idea is very strong. She wants to play h4, h3, and then take on g2 or make that pawn take. And then the light squares in white's camp would be again very weak. And this bishop on g4 would be very strong. So, of course, Stockfish immediately stopped that idea with h3, forcing this bishop back. And after bishop f5, Lilla now has this idea with knight b4 and threatened to take here on c2. And Stockfish decided to defend that with knight d2. And after knight b4, he went knight f3, attacking the queen. And after queen f6, the knight dropped back to e1, is defending c2, and the rook is defending a2. All is well. But in this position, Lilla now played another great move. She played g5. Now, since h4, h3 is not possible, she can maybe get in g4 and by taking on h3 weaken the light squares like this. But there is also a much more immediate advantage to g5, and that is that g5 takes away the f4 square from the knight, allowing queen g6, putting even more pressure on c2. Lilla basically wants this pawn to move forward, and then she can jump in with the knight to d3 and exchange this knight for this knight on e1, which is guarding these light squares here in white's camp, or take the bishop. The game continued now with queen d2, and after queen g6, Stockfish played c4, to which Lilla now responded with knight d3. Stockfish took on d5, and in this position, instead of taking this knight, Lilla decided to take this bishop on b2. And after queen takes on b2 and bishop d6, we now see her idea. This bishop on d6 is a monster. He's attacking down this very important diagonal, and it's very hard to kill. No knights can get close to that bishop and take him out. It has no counterpart and is just a very strong piece. The game continued now with rook d1, and now we have h4. Lilla is kind of reminding Stockfish that this rook is still in the corner and it has to come out and play, otherwise white will be a piece down. And now g3 is not possible, because after h takes on g3, black is attacking this h3 pawn twice and white's king side is collapsing quite quickly. And with g3 not being an option, how is this rook coming out and play? Stockfish now here played king f2, and this allows the king maybe to come to f2, but more importantly it allows Stockfish to get a bit more space with e4 and push back black's pieces. Lilla now here played rook e8 to attack this pawn. Stockfish defended, but now after king b8, Stockfish finally got in e4, and allowing this pawn to get to e5 and attack this very precious bishop on d6 would be a very bad idea. So Lilla just simply sacked his bishop for those two very important pawns, and they both saw this variation, but there was no other way. And Lilla is now very happy with her position, because remember, this rook on h1 is not playing. So Lilla is basically an exchange up in this position. The game now continued with knight c3, and after rook e7, Stockfish goes for a queen exchange. Exchanging queens would allow her to reduce black's attack. Now came queen f6, but after queen f3, Lilla had to play queen g7 since she didn't want to exchange queens. And it looks like Stockfish made some progress. This queen on g7 is not the most active piece. And now Stockfish played knight c2, and he's also trying to fight for the e file, but Lilla shuts that idea down with rook e8. Trying to oppose the rooks on the e file doesn't work, because after rook takes and knight takes, black has this very simple queen takes on d4, winning a pawn, but black has a much stronger move here in this position instead of taking their rook, and that is queen g6, quite simply attacking this knight on c2, the defender of this rook on e1, and white's position now would collapse completely, because after rook takes here and rook takes, this knight is still attacked, the queen has to go back to defend, but now after queen f5 check, forcing the king to g1, there comes bishop g3, and black is threatening here to take out this knight and then mate on e1 with the rook. So that's why after rook e8, Stockfish here played queen f5, and this now denies this diagonal for the black queen. And now the game continued with queen a6, king g1, bishop g3, and now again Lilla has a very strong threat with g4 and infiltrating with the queen on these squares. For example, after a bad move from white, after g4 and pawn takes, rook e1 is again lights out for white because of rook takes, knight takes, queen e3 check, and after king f1, queen takes on e1 is a mate. So after bishop g3, Stockfish defended with rook f1, and it looks like that Stockfish made a lot of progress because he has a very good control of the f-file, and these knights are nicely controlling entry points here into white's position, and it's hard to see how black can make progress. But Lilla again, with a very simple move, made it clear that black is just quite simply much better here, even winning. And she played here c6. And her idea is to exchange these pawns and make the c file open for an attack with the queen or with the rooks. And there's really nothing Stockfish can do here. He played queen d3 to defend these knights, but now queen d6 came, and she wants now to take here. b4, pawn takes, and now after a4, Lilla found another very strong move to deflect this queen from the defense of these knights, and she played f5. And of course, allowing this pawn to live and go to f4 is not really helping white, it just solidifies black's position. So Stockfish decided to take this pawn, of course taking with the rook doesn't work because after rook e1 check, black wins again. There's knight e1, rook e1, rook f1, and here comes a very beautiful move by black, queen f4, making use of the fact that this rook is pinned. And now Lilla would threaten here mate on f2 or f1, and there's only one move for white here, knight d1, to defend the f2 square. But now after rook d1, of course, black wins. After queen takes, there's queen e3 check, rook f2, and then queen takes on f2, mate. So after f5, Stockfish decided to take this pawn with the queen, but this leaves now the c3 knight undefended, and after rook c7, the knight has to move. The queen cannot return to defend the knight because then rook c8 comes, and one of these knights would be lost. So the knight has to move, and now this leaves e2 undefended, so the rook goes into white's position and is attacking now this knight twice. And if this knight moves, then this queen can take on b4. So Stockfish decided now to exchange queens, and after queen takes, rook takes, and king a7, this knight now has to move, and it went to e3, but now this allows the other rook to infiltrate into white's position. And by pinning this knight, Lilla is now threatening to take the other one, and this knight can't move because then this would be lost. So the rook had to go back to break the pin. And now this knight could even take on d5, but Lilla stops that with rook d2, not allowing this knight to move, because then the knight on d1 would be lost. And we can see how Stockfish is in almost complete zugzwang here. This knight can move because it doesn't have squares. Everywhere it goes, it would be taken. This knight on e3 can move because the knight on d1 would be lost. And the rook can move because then this knight on d1 would be lost. Nothing can move, so Stockfish had to play here a5. But now after king b8, he can only give some checks. And here after king d8, there is only one check left. But Stockfish decided to go back. And now after king e8, there really is nothing to move. And this is quite mind-boggling. How can this happen to a 3500 ELU engine? How can he get into this defenseless position? How can a mighty shark be reduced to a defenseless sheep? I just don't understand how these things can happen. Lilla is just very, very good at putting his opponents into zugzwang. And now if the b pawn moves forward, then it's just lost for nothing. So Stockfish, not having anything better to do, played here rook h2. And Lilla now decided to go for a winning endgame, and she took on d4. And this now leads to mass exchanges of the knight f2. She now takes the rook on h2, king takes, she takes the other rook, knight takes. And after rook b4, we can see that this pawn on a5 will soon fall. And in the end, Lilla has a rook and 3 pawns against 2 knights. And this is just too much to handle for white. The game now continued with king f1, king d7, knight d3, king d6, knight f5 check, king e6, knight d4 check, king f6, knight c2, and rook b5. And the winning plan here for black is to push up these pawns up the board, keep white's pieces busy, and then when the pieces are on the queen side, get with the rook to the king side and pick up these pawns on the king side. The game continued now with king e2, a5, king d2, a4, knight b4, and king e5. Lilla's king is trying to get to the white pawns, but the knights are very, very dangerous. She has to tread carefully not to get into some kind of a fork. The game continued with king d6, king e3, rook b1, king d4, and we can see that now the rook is trying to get this pawn, tying the knights down, not only to the defense of the pawn but also to each other. And now the king is trying to handle these pawns here, but after b5, taking here on b5 is losing, because now there's no one stopping this pawn. After a3 and knight b4, rook b1 could come, pinning this knight, and after king a4, rook takes on b4, quite simply wins. If the king takes the rook, the pawn goes in, and if the king takes the pawn, well, this is just completely hopeless here for white. The game continued now with rook g1, king f5, and white's pieces being tied down. This king now finally finds his way into white's position after a little back and forth. Here after d4 now, this king will get in like this. The game continued with king b4, and Lilla's king is advancing, and here now after king d2, it looks like one of these knights will be lost, but no, because there's this knight f3 check, and after king takes knight, knight takes rook. But of course Lilla saw this, and this is still completely winning because now this pawn cannot be stopped. She's pushing also the b pawn and the a pawn, and the knight and the king are helpless. And she's now promoting to a queen, and we can see some pawns falling, and eventually Lilla will queen both of the other pawns. Well, actually one of them will become queen and the other one a knight, because you need also a knight in this position, and she gives up one of those queens. And now, after a couple of more moves, the knight is gone, and now the king is coming to help the queen, and eventually we see a mate on b3. What a game with the black pieces here. Very, very beautiful positional game by Lilla. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other games. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Take care.